Well, I'd like to say something about what we mean by the environment, because I think people are meaning very different things by the term, by the concept, and because they're meaning such different things, they're often talking past one another, and it's important that we understand each other in order to progress with the problem of how to tackle the effects of environmental and climatic change. Because we keep being told by policymakers and scientists that the world is changing in ways that could have catastrophic consequences, at least in the longer term, for human inhabitation of the planet. But I often think in the way that people are talking about the environment, I wonder whether they're really talking about a world that we have ever inhabited. In ordinary life, by environment, we mean the world that surrounds us, with plants and animals busily involved in their own lives as we are in ours. And sometimes we forget this, especially when we're sitting inside lecture theatres and conference halls listening to lectures by people telling us about the environment, but with images on the screen and blinds drawn to cut out the light, and they tell us that the environment is quite different from what we commonly imagine it to be. And this environment is said to be a global environment. And if you think about the Earth and the globe is quite a difficult thing to think that we inhabit. I can think of inhabiting the world that is around me with the earth below and the sky above and the creatures around, but the globe seems like this solid ball, and we humans are stuck around on the outside surface of it. So it's a more general problem of how to link up the sorts of knowledge about the environment that people have from inhabiting it with the sorts of knowledge that scientists are presenting us with about it. So this is the general problem of how to link the knowledge of science with the knowledge of inhabitants. It's a bit like an hourglass with scientific knowledge at the top and inhabitants' knowledge at the bottom, with scientific understandings of the environment at the top and inhabitants' knowledge of environment at the bottom. And I'm not suggesting that we should turn this hourglass upside down, but to turn it on its side so that there can be a proper exchange of ideas between what people know from living in an environment and what scientists can tell us from their observations, recordings and measurements. I mean, the difference between them is this, that if you inhabit an environment, you perceive it quite directly in the way you move around with the senses. It's something that is so much a direct part of your experience that the environment becomes almost part of who you are. But if you're a scientist, the important thing is to maintain a distance, and scientists use instruments and methods to make sure that their own presence does not affect the kinds of measurements they make about the environment. So we need somehow to bring these two things together. And I think the problems are not so much philosophical problems as political problems, in that traditionally the sort of knowledge that comes from science has been powerful, has been the kind of knowledge that the politicians and policymakers respond to, whereas the kind of knowledge that comes from actually inhabiting an environment has been to some extent suppressed. And so we have a situation where the actual poetics of dwelling, the actual way of being in an environment is put to one side, and not recognized as being fundamental to the practice of science itself. So I think what I would want to argue is that we try and move to a situation where science also recognizes that the knowledge that comes from science has to grow out of a practical, purposeful, intimate engagement with the environment in which they're working, whether it be a glacier or a tropical forest or whatever it might be, and that the knowledge grows out of that involvement. And once we recognize that, then it will be easier to put together that knowledge with knowledge of inhabitants. And once we can do that, then we can perhaps better translate the prognostications of scientific research on climate change into practical action that can actually be taken to try and deal with the problems that we face at the moment.
Well, they say all life came from the sea, you know, and I have to admit that coming from New Zealand, I've got a real affinity to the coast and to the oceans. Maybe it's my Pacific heritage. Initially, when we first came to Scotland 11 years ago or 12 years ago, we were inland, and I was a long way away from the coast. And I missed New Zealand. I was homesick. When I came up here, it was just that thought of that if I'm standing up to my ankles in the oceans here on the other side of the world, then actually I am connected to New Zealand still, because all the oceans are connected and everything's connected.
I mean, we're on an island, so you're surrounded by the sea. Our environment is the sea. You can't really get away from that, but we wouldn't want to. Since I was tiny, we were out in the boat or by the beach, and we were just always in the sea or on the sea or around the sea, and it was like being at home. So it's just, you build this connection with it where it's this magical, dangerous but powerful place, and it's a completely other world, but we all just see that in a slightly different way, which I think is really amazing. Even from, say, surfing to people who work on the sea or farm from the sea, or like me, if you're under the water.
Yeah, I'm happy. I love the ocean. I grew up by the sea, so I'm happy to talk about anything. As you know, I've taken on this role to chair the Scottish Blue Carbon Forum, and that covers a wide range of marine habitats and ecosystems. So I can talk broadly, but the work on salt marshes is particularly timely with COP26 coming up, because these habitats can provide some climate mitigation service. It is about creating an opportunity for carbon sequestration. Yeah, I think more broadly, we can view salt marsh as part of a network of habitats that are interconnected. And so adjacent to them, often in the intertidal, subtidal, just below the intertidal zone, we see seagrass meadows often distributed. And these two habitats often work together So some of the carbon that's accumulating in salt marshes, some of it is lost, but can then be retrapped in seagrass meadows. So very often, I think we forget that these ecosystems, these habitats are interconnected. And if we start to damage one, in fact, there are implications and knock-on effects for the adjacent habitat.
Well, I guess so. Seagrass ecosystems are diverse. So I think one of the largest challenges we have as an organisation, or just we have as a society, is that people don't know about seagrass ecosystems. I'd never heard of Seagrass Meadows, and I was a secondary school science teacher, and then I'd spent some time working away as a diving instructor. So I'd spent a lot of time in the ocean, and I was like, how is this not in the public's mind? So we set Project Seagrass really initially to communicate some of the take-home messages that as to why Seagrass Meadows might be important. And then I think the work that we've become most synonymous with in the UK now is Seagrass Restoration. And so we were part of a project with Swansea University, Sky Ocean Rescue and WWF, that partnership in Wales to plant 2 hectares of seagrass. Now, 2 hectares is roughly 2 football pitches. It was only ever really considered as a pilot project, but a project of sufficient scale to show that restoration at scale is possible. So, 2 hectares isn't going to change the climate, but if we can start putting 2,500, 3,000 hectares back, then not only are we going to be providing a habitat for numerous different species, we're going to be providing a carbon sequestering habitat, so a habitat that takes carbon and stores it in the sediments. It also helps buffer ocean acidity, binds the sediment. There's lots of reasons as to why we want to restore seagrass meadows. And it's not like we're putting them there and they were never there. There's a recent paper this year has shown that we've easily lost 50% of our seagrass meadows, and it could be as much as 92%. So these were there, but through various anthropogenic impacts, water quality has declined to a point where we're lost. And so really it's just about putting those ecosystems back and then gaining the benefits of those ecosystems being back for society.
I consider that the climate change and climate crisis are a major urgency that I kind of I'm trying to construct a practice that is responsible somehow of the time that I'm living. It's like I don't think art can be decorative anymore, but actually I find inspiration in so many artists that were capable to move between disciplines and not to be restrained to only think aesthetically in one kind of register or dimension, that were basically using art as a way to deconstruct the world around them and then rebuild it in their own way, and that is very, very powerful to me.
I consider salt marshes an incredibly important coastal habitat. They're very widely distributed around our coastlines. And recently, in the last decade or two, we've realized that they're incredibly important for storing carbon. So the plants grow, they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they have these very rich, organic rich soils that help retain carbon that would otherwise be in the atmosphere, causing the greenhouse effect and the warming of our climate. The other thing we get from these records, of course, is the history of sea level change. And we know that sea level has changed over time. So as we move around the coast, we actually see these different histories of sea level, because the land and sea move at different rates, particularly around the coast of Scotland, because the glacial history, and when the glaciers melted, the land's been lifting up and it's moved at different rates. So there's wonderful stories to tell in these stratigraphies. And then the additional service they provide is through coastal protection. So again, increasingly, we've realized with rising sea levels as another consequence of global warming, that these places protect our coastlines. They act as a buffer zone, if you like. So then they give us an opportunity for climate adaptation. So the carbon side is climate mitigation, and this coastal protection service is a sort of climate adaptation.
Why should we care about seagrass? What are the services that Seagrass Meadows provide for society? So nutrient cycling is one of those. Equally, Seagrass Meadows bind the sediment because they're plants, so they're what we call angiosperms, but flowering plants. They have a root and what we call a rhizome system. Just like on land, if you were to pull a plant out and you'd see that the soil bound around those roots, it's a similar thing in the water. So the seagrass puts its roots into the sediment, and that gives a nice firm holding together, essentially, of the seafloor. So if the seagrass isn't there and there's water movement, then a lot of that sediment gets pushed up into the water column. It gets a cloudy water column. Sometimes nutrients can be pulled up there, and you can get plankton growth and blooms. Whereas if you've got the seagrass there, it binds that, keeps it all locked into the seafloor, and creates that crystal clear water column. But linked to that is also when you have wave water moving through a seagrass meadow, because of all those blades sticking up into the water column, that actually provides a friction, essentially, and it reduces the amount of energy in the water column. So any sediments that are suspended will then fall down between all the leaves and sort of land on the sediment. And so this is actually one way that it captures carbon. And then by that same method, actually, of wave attenuation, we also find lots of microplastics turning up now in seagrass beds for that same reason. Seagrass, again, being a plant, it photosynthesizes. It's what we know as at a young age as being a primary producer. And that is the foundation of that food web then. So and then the seagrass is an engineer. It creates its own, this habitat, this three-dimensional habitat. So you've got plants and algae that can live on the blades of the seagrass. You've got like lots of small isopods, like basically small snails, small crustaceans, crabs, lobsters.
Chances are something lives under there. See if we can find something. So there we've got a couple of sea anemones and sea snail there as well. I mean, there's so much life under here, you don't see it, you don't notice it. Scotland's surrounded by a kelp forest. So we're right amongst the Laminaria digitata here. So this seaweed this is the one we eat a lot of. Now that's all part of a huge kelp forest that, part of the job is that it protects the coastline. It's the first defence for the waves. And it's a nursery. You've got all the fish and crabs and lobsters. They all breed and feed in there. So part of the magic for me is that this part that I'm standing in here, this only gets exposed on several tides in the year. So any other time of the year, I couldn't come and stand here dry like this, and chances are no other human has stood here for maybe ever, or maybe not for tens of thousands of years was the last time a human was standing here. That's pretty magical. And I can go home with something nice to eat.
On the whole, they've been undervalued. And of course, as coastal land, they've been reclaimed historically over a number of centuries, in fact. I think we have to see this as the link between land and sea. And for that reason, salt marshes trap a lot of pollutants and organic material and sediment that is flowing from the land to the sea. And, that provides some protection for our coastal ocean as well. You know, it is this interface between land and sea, which I think our salt marsh habitats really help us understand that these are actually in a continuum. We can't think of the ocean alone, because the ocean partly depends on some of the things that are happening on land.
I can talk a little bit about maybe explain why the North Atlantic circulation is so important to Scotland and Northwest Europe. In the North Atlantic Ocean, we have a series of currents that bring warm, salty water from the south up past Northwestern Europe. Whilst they're transitioning, they're exchanging their heat with the atmosphere overlying it. And that means that actually when you look on a global scale, the climate of Northwest Europe is quite mild compared to some of the places at similar latitudes. So if you think about Lerwick in Shetland, on the Shetland Islands, that is much more mild weather-wise than similar latitude places elsewhere in the globe. For instance, in Alaska or Siberia, where we would expect very quite warm winters, warm summers, and very, very cold winters. In Shetland, we're seeing much milder winters, really, and that is that influence of the Atlantic surface currents bringing warm water from the south and also basically influencing our weather systems. And so you can imagine that if there's changes to the circulation because of climate change, then there's going to be changes that impact our marine life as well.
I have been working on issues relating to Arctic coastal communities for decades, actually. And there are some very important issues having to do with governance, climate change, rapid social change that are affecting basically coastal communities everywhere. These are communities which are very much reliant on the harvesting of marine resources, mostly fish stocks, for their viability and survival.
Nilsimi ataqarpunga maanilu lilussanit inungornikuunga aalisartuullungalu piniartuunga taavalu takornarissani upernassakqimussiussartuullunga maani aalisartuuni luisseqqaani imaannaangittorsuuq ingasampoq sikoqartilluu soorlu massakkut pissuti takutikkaat silaallangoriartornaa malillungu ilulissakaarluat allangoriartorami aama ukiunisiu kingulissaani eqqarsaatingalugu naluarpu sila pissusiaqanuq allangoriartortingissanersoq massakku eqqoriaruminaassinermut taavalu qangarmun aleqqiullugu silaallangornikoruissuunga massakkut sommeq nakkaayunnaarnikuungami аннертууми илулиани микисуни пеқангила ангисоорсуусааруарпи сиорнатсигут массаккут микисуарааннааппут нилликаанерулернера писсутаасимагунерами сорнеқ тунгаани қеққани нунатами икканнерми пеқалерникуусимарпалукками таавалу массаккут микинерулерникууппусиккут силааллангориарторнерамалиллу.
You know, the work that we are doing is very interdisciplinary, and there's a lot of different, of course, aspects when you're thinking about ocean systems. And the main point is that we're always thinking about the human aspect as well. So that's very much my sort of expertise. For example, one of the projects we have is the small scale fisheries. And what we're really trying to look at is sort of the future of fisheries and how fisheries can be more sustainable, and not just the environmental aspects, and also not just the economic aspects, but also the social aspects.
So what brought me to this area particularly was I got offered a seaweed harvest manager's job. And we are a commercial operation, 4 of us hand cutting would cut a ton a day of this particular seaweed. I mean, at the moment, if I come out for myself, I'll cut 2 plants worth. As commercial harvesters, we were harvesting a ton, which on a hand basis, and that was, you know, it's actually hardly affects it. There's so much of it here. But over the space of 6 months, we hand harvested 47 tonne of seaweed. You know, that's quite a lot. But machine harvesters in one day can do 40 tonne in a day. So you can see the difference between hand harvesting and machine harvesting. Quite a big difference. It's a slightly different kelp that they're harvesting, but you know, four people, 6 months, 47 tonne, you hardly blink, and you know, nature hardly noticed it, to be fair. But 40 tonne in a day, over 6 months, how much is that? That's a lot. You know, for myself, it just feels like it's way too much. There, if I was commercially harvesting that whole thing would have gone into my bucket. I've trimmed the ends because we're going to eat that up on the beach in a minute. I've trimmed the ends, they were a bit raggy, we didn't need them. But that's going to go back to the ocean. But where was it, the bit I cut? So here, yeah. So the way that this particular seaweed sporulates or drops its spores, its seed, is from the blades, from the leaves. So by leaving that amount on there, that's still leaving plenty of organic matter there to drop the seed. So no, it's pretty sustainable. What some of the harvesters were doing were, were cutting them here, and all you're leaving is a stipe. You're not leaving anything to drop spores. There's nothing left of it. You know, if you leave this certain amount, that can still drop millions of spores from there.
There's a huge community worldwide. So I have a beachcombing page, for example, on social media, and there's about 15,000 followers, perhaps 15,000. And they're from all over the world. And it's lovely because you share stories, knowledge, finds. There's actually a whole language that goes with beachcombing. You start to learn different words, and it's just, and this overlaps with mudlarking, and people just like to hunt for treasure. But in Fife, because of the history and the landscape, you get good at knowing where's available and what you might find. So for example, I head this way towards St Monans if I'm looking for fossils. Mind you, at Seafield you find them as well. This beach I tend to come to for pottery. We get it the whole way along the coast, but this specific beach smooths it in such a way that a lot of them are jewellery quality. And there's just an abundance here, comparatively speaking. The tides are really easy here. You know, it's good in terms of speed, and there's usually a bit of beach here even if the tide's in. So other places you need to be aware of the tides and the speed that they come in, especially if you're doing something like mudlarking, which is different. But along the Thames it goes to 7 meters or something like that very rapidly.
So we've seen in the Barents Sea, you know, large increases in cod stock, Barents Sea cod stock. So what has been driving that? We understand that's been related to the rapid loss of sea ice in this region and the expansion of the open ocean. So there's the environment is affecting the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is responding. So it's important to understand what drives those changes so that they human activities can be managed appropriately.
Yeah, it's a complex picture, I would say. The animals and marine life, the marine plants are the same, really. They don't necessarily always move with, it's just that the boundaries of their optimal range are moving. So the best place for them to be in the sea has parameters in terms of the temperature they like, the salinity where they do well, the nutrients that they need. And as the ocean circulation changes and as the ocean also absorbs more heat in general from the atmosphere due to climate change, these boundaries of their optimal life range will move. And so they'll generally, for species that prefer quite a cooler habitat maybe, that boundary is going to move northwards. So they're going to, it will look like the species are migrating northwards, but it's the boundary of their optimal range that's moving.
I think models in general may predict that the Arctic will be ice-free by around 2050 or so the next 20, 30 years in the summer. In the winter, there will always be ice. So I think we actually don't really understand properly what will be the consequences of that for the overall circulation of the ocean. So how a completely ice-free Arctic would be. One of the biggest challenges for the ecosystem is the acidification. So, with increases in CO2 in the atmosphere, it's not just the warming, but as long as we have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, we will have a more acidic ocean. And that makes it more difficult for these crustaceans, to build their shells, and so it'll affect the ecosystem in the ocean. It could affect, for example, the uptake of carbon by the ocean.
Well, during a number of years, I have been developing a body of work dedicated to deal with ecological issues using different media. But my main practice is in the field of bioarchitecture. Bioarchitecture to me is not sustainable or green architecture as is commonly understood, but actually a radical reconfiguration of conceptual and material relationships between humans and the non-human part of the ecosphere. I materialize those ideas in sculptures in which I usually incorporate living organisms and biological processes. I'm deeply interested in photosynthetic organisms and their capacity of generating living conditions for other beings. Photosynthetic marine microorganisms generated a breathable atmosphere millions of years ago during a process called the Great Oxidation Event. By incorporating photosynthesis as a central process in my work, I look to sculpt the atmosphere. My project consisted in taking marine diatoms to the lunar microgravity environment. The idea was to see if diatoms could cope with this particular gravity and generate oxygen in space. The idea came actually from the concept of the Great Oxidation Event that demonstrate how humans evolved as part of a complex network of symbiotic relationships that involve photosynthesis. As a sculptor, I see CO2 as the central material of my work. Most of my previous works relate somehow to the current presence of CO2 in the atmosphere. I consider that aerobic organisms like humans and photosynthetic organisms like plants and algae coexist in a very interesting symbiotic balance. These organisms excrete the oxygen we breathe in, and we breathe out the CO2 they use to construct their bodies in exchange. That is a very poetic thing to me.
This is the environment, this is what I love, this wildness. I love the fact that we can be here in the East Nuke, but I can come down here I can squint one eye and I can pretend I'm completely out in the wild somewhere, not another human, can't hear any traffic, you know. So this environment here in Scotland, you know, takes me home, and it just feels like, yeah, the source of all life, you know. I'm connecting with everything. And that's, you know, that's one of my little sayings on my website is where earth, sea and sky meet. You know, when you stand out on the intertidal zone, you know, you feel a part of the sky, the oceans are right there, and the earth, you know, you're surrounded by it, and you just feel like it's one with everything. So it's, you know, it's really hard to describe a feeling. But you know, it's, for me, it's kind of intuition. Everything I do, I kind of work on intuition a lot of the time. You know, a lot of it feels like old knowledge. This feels like stuff that we should just know this stuff, because most likely our ancestors did.
Well, I think talking about being under the water is my favorite topic. It's just, even thinking about or getting ready to go for a swim, you know, it might be raining outside, and just hearing the sound of the rain sort of trigger something in me that's like, right, let's go for a swim. And sometimes I like just sort of sitting on the beach in the rain or blowing a gale, and you just sort of absorb the atmosphere and the peace, even if the sea is roaring. So peaceful. And you know, taking those first freezing steps into the ocean, there's just nothing like it. You know, it's, you're thinking about, you know, nature and what you're doing rather than the cold. And then once you're in, it's just, even in winter, the colors of the sea is incredible. There's nothing like it. I cannot think of a color that would explain the color of when it's dark skies and turquoise sea. And then there have been times I've gone night swimming and the bubbles sort of sparkle in the moonlight. That is just, there's no words for it. I cannot describe the sense of belonging and the atmospheric beauty of it, you know? It's just nowhere I would rather be. If our sea was slightly warmer, I would never come out.
Yeah, so the main way that seagrasses store carbon, as opposed to trees, when a tree grows, as those trees get bigger and bigger and bigger, the organic carbon, the carbon that actually makes up the tree, gets larger and larger and larger. And so that, a lot of carbon is then stored physically in that tree. And so, but when that tree then dies at the end of its life, then some of that carbon is going to then be released back into the atmosphere. So very little is actually being put into the soil. It does happen, but in terms of sediment carbon which gets locked away in the ground, that's not as effective in that environment. There's seagrass meadows in the Mediterranean, which are hundreds of thousands of years old, and there's rhizome mats or beds. So if you can imagine diving, scuba diving, you might see a seagrass bed with a short, maybe 1 meter or 2 meter canopy of seagrass above, but layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of roots and rhizomes from historical seagrass beds, which have, as it's grown up over time. And in there, it's almost a record going back of time of all that sediment that's been captured and stored. So the fact that these seagrass meadows can exist in the same place for generations and generations means that carbon can be locked underground for generations and generations.
But the idea that you could fund restoration of these habitats is gaining momentum. And I think to succeed, government needs to help the wider public understand the value of these places, perhaps to reimagine our coastal wetlands as something of, beauty, of value So I think there is a job to do in terms of educating, understanding, and some, of course, in my own area, research to be done. I would say, with young people, the great opportunity here is that these habitats are widespread, they're easily visited, they're quite safe places on the whole to visit, and you can understand these processes as they're happening. You can see the tides coming in and out, you can see nature. It brings the whole idea of this range of services to life in a way that when we talk about the wider marine environment, it's sometimes a little abstract. It's beneath the surface of the ocean. It can be hard sometimes to visualize everything that's happening there. So I think these coastal fringes where people live and work and can visit, they provide an exciting entry, if you like, into the wider marine ecosystem that we have.
Space exploration is capable to actually realize how rare we are, how strange this place is, and unique, because we have everything we need right here, which is really amazing. Things are very, very comfortable for us here, rather than the moon or Mars. But looking at this from the perspective of bioarchitecture, I guess that if we could survive in Mars, then we can learn from that experience and apply those technologies and those modes of generating our material reality here on the planet. Because these systems that are required for survival in space require a lot of optimization. There's no such concept of like garbage, or there's no room for anything that could be contamination or any other a kind of waste. You cannot afford waste, and I guess that is something that we could learn here. So I guess that design is in space could actually teach us something about how to live here in our planet.
Yes, I think so. I think there is a shift in general in terms of valuing the earth we live in a different way than we may have done in the recent past. And so that's definitely, the ocean story is definitely part of that. I think for a lot of people, the ocean is still what you see from the coastline to the horizon. And I think the benefits of the ocean really outstretch what we can grasp in our minds or in our vision. And that is something that maybe it's already happening, but I think a bigger shift is needed in terms of people valuing the ocean really at a global scale, or the entire basin scale, so to speak. And how we instill that in people is something that I find intriguing. I don't have an answer to. When you especially in terms of climate change, the oceans really absorbed more than 90% of the additional heat from climate change. So it's really a buffer and an important component of the Earth system that's maybe undervalued by people still.
Descriptions are not enough. We need to actually embody this knowledge, and knowledge is much more than data. Knowledge is something much deeper, I guess. So what art is good at is to involve all the senses and all the layers of the human being to actually reflect on that knowledge somehow. And obviously creativity plays a major role there. but creativity is also something that could power scientific thinking.
Yeah, participation, and I think that's one of the biggest drivers. You know, we can develop the science, but we've got to take people with us. If you can present them with a way that they can make a change, they will make a change. Like, people want to address these. We've got two crises, haven't we? We've got the climate crisis and we've got the biodiversity crisis, broadly speaking, a nature crisis. By putting nature back, it helps with both of those. Put nature back and nature will help sequester carbon. You put nature back, it allows biodiversity to thrive. By putting seagrass meadows back, you get carbon sequestration and you get biodiversity. And hopefully seagrass can then be a sort of a gateway habitat, a vehicle for really thinking about restoration more broadly, especially in the marine environment. I think for me, seagrass is a plant. I mean, it is a plant for everyone, but for me, it's because it's a plant, people can engage with the plant because conceptually they understand plants. They understand that seeds planted grow into plants. So it's accessible, I think, as a like I say, as a vehicle for thinking about seascape restoration. And that's really, for me, even though I'm sitting here as Chief Executive Project Seagrass, for me, the big vision here is we need to think about restoration at the seascape scale in the same way that we think about restoration at the landscape scale on land. We need to be thinking big.
It is really important that we protect the oceanic habitats because, as far as we understand, life originated in the sea. In times of climate crisis, the ocean not only represents our origin, but also represents our future.
The one thing we could do is give more value to the ordinary, everyday acts of care, of looking after people and looking after our local environments and looking after the things that matter to us, which we do as a matter of course, but tend not to value. Because when people talk about sustainability and sustainable solutions, they immediately jump to grand plans, technologies, great feats of engineering, great solutions that will somehow work and solve the problem. But they forget that actually it's in these little acts of care that we actually, all of us, do our little bit for the continuity of life. So I wrote a little piece called The Sustainability of Everything, which is based on the idea that you can't have sustainability for some things and not others. If you're talking about a sustainable world, then it's got to be a sustainable world for everyone and everything, both now and to the indefinite future. And you think, how on earth you can't really plan for that. But what you can do is to recognize that everything you do that contributes to the sustainability of life, like looking after your kids, or doing some gardening, or caring for the local environment, all of these little things are acts of care, which, from where you stand, contribute to the continuity of life. And that's all we can do. All we can do is to try and keep the show on the road, keep life going. What we can't do is plan for some kind of solution, God help us. I think we should stop talking about sustainability in these very abstract, grandiose system thinking terms, and realize that actually sustainable practices are going on all around us. Every time we care for anything.